He doesn't seem to understand what warfare was like at all before, let's say, World War One, World War Two.
The hats are so goofy, I think.
Come on! Oh! Hi and welcome to History Legends. One of you sent me a video that I should react to on Instagram. Let's check it out. Basically, it's a Marine from a channel called Combat Arms channel reacting to another video from Armchair Historian, the evolution of US Army uniforms. And with all respect, this video is not a criticism against him, because I know that a lot of the things he was wondering about is widespread with the public. And at the same time, he's more specialized with everything regarding modern military.
Oh,
which
nice.
allowed the musket ball to spin for far greater accuracy. Uniforms of this period maintained a predominantly blue color palette.
So I feel like they went a little bit backwards. So this kind of seems like
What?
a step forward because, like, when you talk about the riflemen, they were a little bit more professional, like true infantrymen. So their uniforms weren't like super like ostentatious, like super flashy, not really standing out so much. But then they go to like the War of 1812, and it's kind of going back to where it was during the Revolutionary War, which I guess is kind of cool. But I wonder why they made that specific design. I guess these guys might not be specific like riflemen.
So, the big question of the day: why did armies historically wear these bright uniforms? What he's asking is actually a widespread question. And people often mock, for example, the British during the Revolutionary War because they had like these highly visible red uniforms and they were marching in line against these super smart American militiamen hiding behind trees and wearing this camouflage uniform that he liked so much. The problem is that it doesn't reflect the art of war of that time period. First of all, I think the most important thing that you have to remember is the range of these weapons at the time. So this is what we'll check. So effective range of muskets 18th century. So here it says it 100 yards, about 91 meters. And to really put things into perspective, I took this football, soccer field dimensions in comparison. Basically, it's from one touchline to another. That's 75 yards. It's a bit more than that. Firefights in that era, 1800s, 1700s, would take place at about soccer field range. That means that stealthiness was not so important because even if you could see the guy, you couldn't even shoot him or pose any threat to the guy. For example, Napoleonic battle. Check this out. This is one example. I think this is the Peninsular War, British battles, yes. But you see how even if you could see the guys far away on the battlefield, you could not pose any threat to these guys. There's this interesting website called Napoleonistica. I think it's a German that owns it. Excellent website. Like, I read everything he has on this website. Okay, check this out. Infantry tactics and combat. He has an entire article about what it was like fighting with muskets during the Napoleonic Wars. And this really changed even to me, like it changed my perspective on how battles were fought. Musket accuracy in real combat. Okay, the first thing he says is that one is firing very differently in battle than on the drill ground. And this is very interesting because it's basically the same today, but when we see reenactments, it's always organized, but in the battle, when the other guys are also shooting at you, it must have been very different. Soldiers don't have the luxury of taking long, careful, precise aim and gently squeezing of the trigger. And then he gives examples. Accuracy for volleys fired at point blank. 30, 60 yards. Okay, this is literally soccer field range, like not even. For example, here, during one of the battles of the Revolutionary War, French General Duhem found his battalion firing at Austrian battalion at 100 paces. That is 100 yards about. It was a lengthy firefight and Duhem expected heavy casualties. He was, however, very surprised there were only 3 to 4 men hit. And right below there is Hughes calculated for Albuera, battle during the Peninsular War. For several volleys at 100 yards, the British Redcoats achieved 5% ratio of casualties. And the last thing here, according to R. Hennigan, the British infantry at Vittoria fired on average 459 rounds for one French casualty. Not only does this break the myth of the British infantry being so good at firing, but it also shows that musketry fire was not deadly, even at close range. And this is a bit what we can see here, that the battles took place at an extreme close range. So even if you could see the enemy from afar, stealthiness was not important. But there's another factor, and this image leads to the point number 2. Look at all the smoke. Look at all the smoke. It's so dense. I don't know who did that painting, that drawing, but beautiful. This is another thing we forget with musket fire. In reenactments, you see some smoke coming out, but from what Brandon F. explained, now unlike what you can see in reenactments, these soldiers actually fired real black powder and not this white stuff that you see in reenactments. Now, not only did it make a lot more noise, but it covered the battlefield in deep smoke. You see, this is an example of modern reenactment. It would have been 2 times that in reality. You see, this is another example. After one volley of only, how many? You have 9 guys. You can't see them anymore. Again, a lot of smoke. This is the US Civil War, and you see that with a line of men firing, you can't see a couple meters ahead of you. Check this out. Now, here, there's a beautiful one. What does this mean? Imagine hundreds of men firing. You have a huge cloud of smoke in front of you. You don't see anything. The battles at the time were some sort of set-piece battle within a battle. After a couple volleys, we can assume that both sides kind of stopped firing for some time because there was so much cloud and fog that you couldn't even see the enemy. So after every volley, with all the smoke, every additional volley would be less accurate than the previous one because the soldiers are firing at random. And that could explain why, even if they fired multiple volleys, casualties would not increase dramatically. Now, if we go back to the Napoleonitska website, right here, he says something about friendly fire. He lists some examples of friendly fire. Here, right here, in 1809 at Talavera, 2 British regiments of foot became so disorganized and frightened after French attack that they fired at each other. Both regiments then took cover behind the 45th and 60th Regiment of Foot, reformed, and the British division retreated, covered by the cavalry. The British lost 440 men, while the French lost less than 100. In 1809 again at Wagram, the white-clad Saxon infantry was fired upon by the French allies because the French confused the white uniforms of the Saxons with the white outfits of their Austrian adversaries. And this is the reason why, at one point, armies started standardizing the uniforms. But you can see, even at the pinnacle of line infantry battles, you had armies that shot at each other. That means that you wanted to have bright uniforms so people could know what side you're on. Yes, the enemy could see you, but the first thing you didn't want to happen was that your own guys, your allies, fire at you by mistake. And from what I read here, these examples, it seemed to have happened a lot when you had armies with many nationalities. That means that the soldiers fighting did not recognize all the uniforms of their allies. Of course, how do you expect them to know? So, for example, at Wagram, they saw white uniform, they thought it was Austrian, boom, it was their allies. So in the end, the 3 main reasons why soldiers at the time wore these bright uniforms: 1, because the range of musket fire was very small; 2, because of all the smoke you could not see friend from foe; and 3, to avoid friendly fire. Technically, points 2 and 3 are basically the same. This is a good example here. Even during the US Civil War, these reenactors, they all fire at the same time, and you barely see the guys in front of them. Now, there's another reason. It's because in the middle of the battle, the commander wants to know where his men. They didn't have telephones or radios. So what did they do? They went on a hill or the highest position they could have. They would look at the battlefield. So if it was Napoleon, he would look at blue uniforms. Okay, these are our guys. For example, white, okay, they're Austrian. Red, they're British. So being visible was actually a good thing. That way the commander could see his men, move them around like he wants, or at least that way a general can move his men and see where they're located on the battlefield and and enact the strategy that he had in mind. And talking about that, the first time that one country used one standard uniform for all their troops was Sweden under Gustavus Adolphus in 1632. Check this out. Swedish uniform, 30 Years War. He's the one that basically took the colors of Sweden, blue and yellow, and basically told all his men to wear something like that, some sort of standard uniform. And the reason is simple, it was just to spot his men faster on the battlefield. And after that, more and more armies actually started providing standardized uniforms to their men. The one that followed right after was Cromwell during the English Civil War, which provided this red color. Cromwell, English, New Model Army, that's the name, New Model Army uniform. You can see it was not the typical red coat uniform, but the infantry was indeed red, wearing red. It was also the first time that soldiers were given a uniform to keep. You see, it was the start of the famous red English and British uniform, and you can see everything was red. And this is something that I noticed a lot, is that when one country invents or comes up with a good idea, once it's proven to be effective, every other country copies. Now, the moment that armies started to move away from these shiny uniforms was when smokeless powder was invented. I think during the early 1880s. And the range of firearms during that same period dramatically increased. For example, French chassepot effective range. Just 1,200 meters. Of course, that was not the real effective range, but that means that if you see a guy 500 meters away, you could potentially hit him. So not only did firearms make less smoke when fired, they had a longer effective range, and as you can see here, they have a much higher rate of fire. And that was the same for artillery. So this is when, yes, being too visible on the battlefield provided less benefits than before. And once again, it's actually the British that were among the first in the world to have a uniform that matched the terrain in which they fought in. For example, British colonial uniform, Boers War. You can see that already in the late 1800s, early 1900s, they matched the terrain, this khaki uniform. And they moved away from, as you can see, the very red, invisible red, to the khaki uniform. And they learned this because of the Boers. During the first Boers War, you can see the British had these red uniforms, and at every battle they would be fired at by these highly mobile Boer fighters that obliterated them. Skillful riflemen, the British lost a lot of men. Then they adapted. There's another thing that, so the guy who sent me the video on IG sent me 2 parts, two covers, and that's the second one, I think. I just marked it down.
X over their torso and whatnot, so these parts today. But I mean, again, it's still like really blue, so it's standing out a lot. These guys probably stand out like a sore thumb.
Again, we just talked a lot about it. He doesn't seem to understand what warfare was like at all before, let's say, World War I, World War II. However, there is something he mentioned at the beginning. I remember he said there was some pride in your uniform, and that was also one thing that was very important at the time. When you had these armies marching through towns with marching bands, nice flags, beautiful uniforms, it made young men want to enlist. Just like today, you have badass military commercials to attract young men to enlist. The commercial ads of the time was marching through towns with marching band, the sound of trumpet, with the nicest, fanciest, clean uniforms that everybody would be jealous of. And nice uniforms are also expensive, so you know that this army will treat you well if they have nice uniforms, if they can waste so much money on nice uniforms. It's a generalization, but you get the idea of how people thought at the time.
But I mean, the hat looks like a military hat, especially a lot more modern as far as today. But even still, it doesn't seem like the best like combat sort of hats. I mean, they have the front visor, so maybe that'll keep like some of the sun out of your eyes and whatnot. But even still, I mean, you still have this white X over their torso and whatnot. With these.
And he continues by saying the following.
Entirely different uniforms. When the Confederate States seceded from the Union, the CS Army opted for a more gray and earthy tone. The Confederate
hats are so goofy, I think.
Come on! Oh! Alright, so the video from Armchair Historian is actually excellent because you really see the transition of uniforms. Now, you see they have these visor caps, the kepi, and you might wonder why did they wear that, but the question I have for him, what else could they wear? What you have to remember is that a lot of the headgear that soldiers would wear was simply because it was fashionable for civilians to wear something like that at the time. A bicorn was popular among every part of the society back in the day, so soldiers would also wear that. Now, then they figured out that having this bicorn type of headgear was kind of annoying, especially if you wanted to fire it, like it got in the way. So they came up with the shako right here. So when you fired, it didn't block your field of vision. You didn't have to move it around to get it out of the way. And you had this little visor that protected from the sun and helped you in some way to fire, or even if it was raining, like it wouldn't go directly into your eyes. And the other benefit was that it made you look taller. And the other reason is because if you look taller, when aiming at you, the enemy's naturally going to raise up the musket because they think you're taller. And since the musket balls were inaccurate, they would often fly way above your head in result. For example, here, the US foot soldier in 1846, they changed headgear again. Why? Because this was what workers wore, factory workers, anyone. This is what was trendy at the time. Now we move on to this kepi. It wasn't trendy to wear that. So why did soldiers wear this? As a reminder, the working class of most Western countries had some sort of flat cap. They all wore hats, but not a kepi. And this is interesting because it's a bit like the Marine here. He's wearing this sort of cap, baseball cap that we call. Why is he wearing that? Why do we see a lot of special forces guys or military guys wearing these caps? Because they like wearing these in civilian clothing as well. They like to wear these in everyday environments. So you could expect the soldiers from back in the days to think the same way. They wanted to be somewhat comfortable. Now, the visor cap, the kepi, is actually inspired by the French. When the French first went on in their conquest of Africa, in Algeria, they had the shako, just like the Americans. Battle of Algiers, 1830. Okay, check this out. The French have the shako. Okay, here again, you can see very Napoleonic style uniform. But then they changed. The main reason was because the shako was heavy and it didn't really protect against the sun. So basically, you were sweating having this on your head. It was warm, hot, and the soldiers didn't like it. So they simply replaced it with a cap. And since the French army was the best army of the time and everybody wanted to copy them, well, every army in the world, including the American Union forces and everyone, started to copy their headgear. Once an army is the best in the world, everybody wants to copy them. Even if the uniform has nothing to do in them winning battles, you want to replicate. You want to simulate them. Anyway, that's my thought. Maybe I'm completely wrong, but let me know in the comment section what you thought of my analysis. If you're new to this channel, don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you enjoyed the information I provided to you today, don't forget that you can support me on Patreon. The link is in the description.